It's great to be here. Thank you for all of the people that are participating here locally, that have traveled, the people that are watching online. We have a pretty big group of people. Our panel discussion today, A View from the Top, we're going to be talking to the different executives from 4 different ports that have joined us today, talking about some of the issues that we've already discussed and getting into other issues. So again, make sure, we want this to be interactive, and for you to spend time here, for you to get something out of the panel discussion. I think it's important for you to be a participant. So make sure you submit questions to us through the application. What we're going to do is start out and have each panelist give a little bit of an introduction. I have a few questions to be able to ask them, but really want to spend time on the Q&A part of questions coming from you, the audience. A couple of things, and I wanted to start just quickly framing out the discussion. I've been talking about maritime cybersecurity. I think the first conference I spoke at, and you could fit everybody from that conference at this one table up here, was I think 2007 and 2008, and people said that, oh, you're crazy, this is never going to be an issue, and now we look at 2025 as it being a substantial evolving threat, not only for ports, but the global maritime industry in general. Over the past month, I've had the opportunity to sit in briefs on cybersecurity for the maritime industry, in a couple of things that I picked out I thought were extremely alarming. One of them is that as we looked over the last few years and kind of look at the different hacking organizations and state actors globally and what they're concentrating on from an attack perspective, over the past year, we've seen 15% of those organizations shift to concentrate on maritime and maritime infrastructure. So we've gone in the last probably 10 months from 0 to 15% of these global organizations looking at that. And I found that as very alarming from a port and a maritime and shipping infrastructure. The other piece that I thought was very interesting from a briefing perspective was that we're going to start to see some of these threats that we've seen in silos, whether it's been a potential physical attack on a port or a cyber attack or a drone or whatever that may be. We're going to start to see the intersection of these threats in the coming months start to come together. So it's interesting when you think about that from a maritime and port perspective and how we protect ourselves from that. So we'll get into a little bit of that in the question and answer, but what I want to do now is give the opportunity for each one of our panelists to be able to introduce themselves and give some brief kind of opening remarks while you guys start to look at and think about questions that you want to pose to the panel. So I'll start off right here to my left with Stephen.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Steve Burdian. I'm the Senior Director of Public Safety and Security at JAXPORT. I've been with the company for about a year. Prior to that, my background is also Coast Guard. I was a ship driver by trade, and I retired out of Miami as the Chief of Response, where we facilitate a lot of drug interdiction, emergency response, incident management, and just day-to-day operations for the Coast Guard. One of the great things about joining JAXPORT was, it's a port that's growing. We've got 4 facilities. 3 of them are marine. 1 of them is cruise. We just, as a matter of fact, expanded and had our Norwegian Cruise Lines have their inaugural cruise this past Friday, so we're excited about that. And we have a diversified portfolio of different products that come throughout, whether it's brake, bulk, container, autos, and things along those lines. So we're excited. We have about a $44 billion economic impact annually for the state and the region, so we're excited about that, working with our critical partners. And we're talking routinely on a lot of these issues with federal, state, and local partners to make sure that we're ready and we're able to efficiently move products through our facilities and meet the emerging threats that pose against us. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sam Sullivan. I'm the manager for the Port Putnam, Florida's only river port. It's a developing port, unlike the other ports represented today at this panel. For a long time, we're an untapped asset related to the Cross-Florida Barge Canal, if some of you might remember that project. We are developing the port, and part of the development that we're finding out that instilling security and resilience in every project as we develop this port into a functional port. has been a very efficient way to look at things. And I'm excited to be here. Look forward to hearing from the others on the panel and from further panels later today.
Thank you. I'm Chad Harrod. I run a real estate development firm here, based here in Tampa, and I'm currently serving as the chairman of Port Tampa Bay. And hands down, by far, I have the least amount of security experience up here. But the commissioners at Port Tampa Bay, like other ports, are appointed by the governor. And the governor called me and said, "Hey, I got a question for you, but you're not allowed to say no." And I said, "Okay." And he said, asked me about doing this, and I said, he asked, "What do you think?" And I said, "Well, you told me I'm not allowed to say no. So let me take some time and think about it, because I don't want to do this unless I think I can do a good job." And I came back and said, "Okay, this is something." I grew up in Tampa, looked at the port every day, but really had no idea what we did. And back to my level of experience, I mean, aside from owning a 26-foot boat, or part owner of a 26-foot boat, I have that's my maritime experience. And then I have a concealed weapons permit, which is pretty much my security experience. But what I do, I think, provide, I say that jokingly, I'm heavily involved in security for an annual golf tournament up in Georgia, and it's not that different than I think the security as it relates to a port, in that I mean, up there, the budget is not a word they use, but at the same time, it's all about the patron experience and making sure that everyone is safe without sacrificing the patron experience. And similar to here is making sure everything is safe without slowing down the wheels of commerce. And so hopefully I bring an outside perspective, someone with limited security experience, but maybe an overarching view, or not overarching, but I can kind of look from the top down and say, hey, this is how we need to balance what you guys do every day, which is security, with making sure that the wheels of commerce keep spinning.
Good morning. My name is Dave St. Pierre, and I'm the Senior Director of Public Safety and Security at Seaport Manatee. That's that other port on Tampa Bay. My history, well, I guess I had the lesson learned and the big awareness while I was still on my final tour in the Coast Guard, when I was assigned to the Marine Safety Office in Tampa right after 9/11, when there were no regulations, when there were no training, when there was no infrastructure. All that time we had to figure out how to make it work. So I have been in this region almost, 25 years working in the ports. I spent my first 3 years working for Port Tampa Bay once I retired. And I've been down at Seaport Manatee for the last 20. Security has been a continuously growing and evolving issue. Okay, we've tried to keep ahead of it. Our port does have a MARAD and then U.S. Coast Guard approved facility security officer training program, so we take the training elements very seriously at our port. We also put in a lot of infrastructure to try to support our security operation. But what we have learned is, no matter how evolved and how much we move on, the issues continuously change and evolve. Okay, so I hope that that's what we're going to be looking into, is dealing with a lot of those critical issues as they develop and move on.
Thank you. I'm going to start out with you, Chad, because I think you have a really interesting perspective where you look at the other gentlemen on the panel are kind of day-to-day operations and looking at these threats. But being that you're appointed by the governor and a part of the board, how do you guys look at these threats when you're looking at, hey, overall budgets and operations, and kind of how you do what you do on the board level? I mean, there's a lot of different projects I know that you probably want to focus on, but how does security and that kind of side of the operation figure in kind of from the board level?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think for me to ever try to get smart on what these guys do every day would be a futile effort. So I think in my position, what I do is I rely on our staff, and most specifically Mark Dabina, our Senior Director of Port Security here at Port Tampa Bay. And I have to rely on them to be the subject matter experts. And Mark will tell you, every time he brings something to our board for approval, I understand a lot of it, but I don't understand it all. But what I do ask him every time is, Mark, is this what you need? Is there something else you need? Take budget out of the conversation for a second, and make sure you're getting what you need. And so I think from that's kind of my job. It's not to be as smart as Mark. I'll never be as smart as him as it relates to security and other, but it's to give him the resources and give him the freedom to think. Here's what fits my budget, but here's what I think is coming, and give me a little bit of warning, and let us find the way to find the dollars to combat what we're not even thinking about yet. Because again, I'm not going to think about it. I'd like to, but I rely on people like Mark to tell me what they need.
Thank you. One of the things I wanted to touch on a little bit was a topic that was addressed by Mr. Inman and General Kinsey in the last session, is kind of talk about drones. And we've seen the evolution of the drone threat globally expand substantially over the past couple of years. I mean, we can look at the attack that Ukraine perpetrated on Russia, where they had drones in containers that went hundreds of kilometers deep into Russia. So it's definitely one of the bigger threats when we look at ports, but those communities beyond the ports. But from the perspective of what you guys are doing from a port perspective, how are you looking at that drone threat, and what does that look like, and what are some of the things that you guys are thinking about to be able to protect the ports, port infrastructure from that? And I know that some of this could get into the kind of the confidential space and the security plan space, but kind of stay high level and say, hey, what are we looking at? Because that is one of the top threats, I think, outside of cyber.
I'll jump in. So it's one of our main concerns, not only from just a critical infrastructure piece. If you looked at the conflict and how that changed the battle space for the conflict, that has crossover to what we do today. Whether it's looking at some of the cargo that we're moving across the facilities, we do a lot of military movement as well with Blunt Island Command. So we want to make sure that we don't have that broadcast all over. We don't have a no-fly zone over our facilities, but I do know, especially I was at a conference with the Center of Naval Analysis in September, and one of the briefings that we did get was the Coast Guard working with FAA to try and be able to designate critical infrastructure and put no-fly zones on top of those. So we're excited, we're hopeful, but as the General, Mr. Inman, was talking to as well, you can detect, you can identify, then what do you do afterwards? And what are the authorities, and who's going to have that kind of authority to act should you need to? Because there's a bunch of liabilities and things along those lines. What we do in the interim is we work with our local, state, and federal partners, one, to make sure we have good awareness of the threats that are coming on. We report those to the NRC with the Coast Guard, so they have those as suspicious activities if we think we're seeing a lot of activity, so they have it and log it. And then we're part of the discussion to address it. But it's a difficult problem set to tackle, but it's something that's on the forefront of our concerns.
We haven't had any drone issues, but if that arose, we would work with our local law enforcement partners.
David?
We don't really have a lot of drone issues either. We're pretty rural and don't see a lot of that type activity. We do use drones a lot ourselves for surveying and purposes, but as far as seeing a whole lot of that activity around the port, currently that's not a large issue for us.
Is it something that you guys are thinking about for the future? Because like Port Lauderdale or Port Everglades, Miami, Jacksonville, Tampa are seeing that kind of on a regular basis. Is that something that you're thinking to be able to say, hey, this is something that we need to look at and potentially pay attention for the future?
Okay, we do pay attention to it.
Sure.
Okay, we in fact have a process on how we try to maintain the highest awareness. We also see ourselves in the transportation picture on a larger note, because those main channels go right by our port. So the activities that they worry about in Tampa as far as crews and the like and wanting to protect, there are vulnerabilities that exist just because of our proximity. So we do monitor for it. But as far as that type of activity, right now we don't see a lot of it. But we really are engaged in with the other ports in trying to make sure that they have the tools they need to do the mitigation, because ultimately it affects us all.
Right, because there's something just because of the proximity of your location that you can see that would be an early warning for potentially Tampa.
Yes.
Let's kind of shift a little bit and talk about cyber. That's kind of the bigger topic as we have some more questions from the audience start to come in. From the perspective of port security, and even if we just look at over the last 5 or 6 years, you know, cyber wasn't as high on the scale as a threat as it is now. How do you guys look at that in a day-to-day operations from a port perspective with cyber and the other issues that you're dealing with?
It's another daily conversation. I think, you know, there are examples, whether or not it was one of the carriers that had an incident, some ransomware, one of the other ports in the nation that had some ransomware issues, something that we think about. We try and look at it from an infrastructure standpoint. How are our systems hardened against the threats? If we do, and one of our monitoring systems picked it up, what is our immediate response? What are our reporting requirements? If they are able to actually, in fact, make an impact on one of the systems that are critical to day-to-day operations, how are we able to recover, and what's the timeline for recovering? And so we look at it as individual systems to try and harden against those attacks. We did take advantage of the Coast Guard's Cyber Assist team. That was something that we thought was very worthwhile. You know, you invite a regulatory agency in to look at you. You know, there's some risks associated with that, but the benefits were significant. That helped us harden some of our systems and best practices. So we were very excited about the results on that. But we spend a lot, and we're standing up our team to be more proactive as well. They monitor systems instantly, and they have protocols in place to do that. But it's not just from that, it's whether or not somebody who's coming to service one of your equipments, whether it's a crane or something else on the port, they can install some type of device that then makes that, you know, impact the efficiency and whether or not that piece of equipment works. So we look at our contractors, we make sure that the scope of work is clearly defined, we know who is going to touch any of our equipment. We spend a lot of time just making sure that we're set so we know what's happening and then we can respond as well.
Similarly, you know, we make sure that our systems are as hardened as possible. That goes through different technologies, the software as well as hardware networking to prevent attacks. But the main point really, and I think the general was the one who mentioned this earlier, is education. If your users are vulnerable, then your network is vulnerable. So the key focus that we've been focusing on right now has been educating our users to make sure that we are not vulnerable at that level.
I think back to my theme of kind of looking at things a little bit differently. You know, the question came to our staff was, are we going to bring in someone in-house that is really in charge of cybersecurity, or are we going to outsource that? And I think the way I looked at it was, you know, we could go find the best nerd, I'll say, that does that, or we can hire a firm. And so I hope we're not like Port of Los Angeles, where we're getting a hit every 39 seconds, like I heard earlier. But my thought was, I'd rather have a firm out there that is looking at all different attacks or attempts, rather than someone who's just looking at the attempts that come into our port. The idea being that you just see more, and just like drones, I feel like we're chasing our tail, right when we think we know how to combat or to detect some of the whether it be drones or cyber, it's changing. And so hiring an outside firm, I just felt like gave us a broader reach, or really just a bigger sample size of what types of threats are out there than having it in-house.
What's interesting as we start looking at the evolution is that as we started mitigating physical security problems, a lot of that was done with cyber and computer systems. So the more that we mitigated our vulnerabilities in the physical realm, we increased and gave ourselves new vulnerabilities in the cyber one. So if I look at our process and protocol, we did a significant investment in cyber technology to meet a lot of our other security issues to keep the commerce moving. Our biggest focus over the last several years, though, is ensuring the integrity and the hardness of those systems so they cannot be attacked. And that's using a combination of the things that we've been discussing. We have some in-house capability where we monitor and we update and we make sure we maintain that integrity. We focus on the training because everybody who uses those systems is the weakest link. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter who that person is. If you give them access to a cyber system, they have the capability of introducing a vulnerability there. So that's training is a big part of the issue. We do some outside contracting to not only assess and evaluate our systems, but also monitor. There is technology you can put in place to play that gate guard, that monitor those systems to alert when there are those intrusions. That's how Los Angeles knows it has those thousands of attacks a day, is because it's got equipment and stuff that watches that. It's that combined approach and making sure you have good segregation between your IT and your OT systems and maintaining that integrity is part of the things. Those are the things that keep me up at night these days, because where we used to look at that person come to our gate as a person that we had to block his access, that person can be in China trying to do that remote access.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting point, is no longer is the threat located just here outside the gate or on the water side. The threats, in Iran or North Korea, Russia, China, or, 100 other locations around the world, because it's so much easier to be able to say, well, it's a lot of logistics for me to get someone to that gate, here at the Port of Tampa Bay to be able to perpetrate someone or something, when I can, have them in a basement somewhere on a computer trying to be able to, to access those networks. And I think when my personal opinion, when I look at the cyber piece, it's very similar to the drone piece. Is, we're allowed to be able to monitor this, we're allowed to look at this, but we're not allowed, here in the States, to be able to pull the trigger to actually attack back, down that chain, and which would be really helpful for us to be able to say, well, not only can we monitor this, but we can disable all of this from taking place. So from that perspective, I feel like here in the United States, we're hamstrung a little bit on the response side when it comes to cyber. When we see threats, is to be able to try to block it, but we can't actually physically go out and go after that threat. On the coordination side, there was a question that's come in that I think is really interesting, and I'll pose it to the panel here. Is we've talked about the challenges of sharing lessons learned across port installations, but here in Tampa, how are the port security leaders tied into our aviation partners at the Florida airports to try to find common investments and solutions to shared challenges? And I would probably take that question even further, is, the coordination not just with airports, but with other government agencies, and organizations around. And from the maritime perspective, how are we dialed in to that kind of information sharing? We touched on it a little bit, but I thought it was just a really interesting question, kind of based on a little bit of what David was saying.
Some of the ways we coordinate is through the city. They'll bring in their emergency operations center. We'll get together. We'll look at some of the emergency plans. We'll all have input. We'll talk about some of the threats we've seen. So we do share in that way. The captain of the ports for the Coast Guard at the individual sectors, they have quarterly meetings with folks and port partners to bring them in. Sometimes aviation will come in there. But we're trying, I think that the big point is we try to meet with our partners, whether or not they're city, whether or not they're just port partners or federal, et cetera. We try and have routine meetings to address some of the common threats and risks that we see out there so that we can have a great idea, because nobody has a monopoly on a great idea. And something that the aviators may have may translate to the naval and the maritime industry as well. So we have routine conversations, and I think that's a good thing.
Well, when you think about it too, and this is one of the things that I talk about all the time, is when you look at the port and the maritime industry in general, it's very different from a cyber perspective of how you look at securing a port or a ship vice how you're going to secure a bank or a hospital or an office building or a university. It's when you look at port operations and shipboard operations from a cyber perspective, there's IT devices, okay, great, but there's a pretty substantial amount of OT devices that run on those networks, and the protection of how you do that is a lot different than when you look at, the IT perspective. So that was one of the things from an information sharing perspective that I thought was interesting to say, okay, what's aviation? Because they have a lot of OT devices, as well. I don't know if anybody else wanted to kind of comment on the information sharing side of it.
I think Paul Anderson, our CEO here at Port Tampa Bay, he serves on a bunch of, and I forget all the acronyms, but it's basically a National Ports Council. And I think, after every event, especially say the hurricanes of last year, we did an after-action report, and we were really intentional about what went right and what went wrong, and not only figuring that out for ourselves, but sharing that with our port partners around the Gulf and elsewhere, and really making it intentional to go talk to those ports. I remember we were approving something for a disaster. I think it was Balfour or someone. You pay a fee that helps you in the event of a disaster, and I asked our staff to go. I said, talk to the other guys who've actually been through that disaster, whether it be Baltimore or Galveston or whomever, and go figure out how Balfour did, but also what lessons did you learn? And I think it's really just common sense of sharing our experiences and being willing to say we did things wrong. And
sometimes that's tough to do, right? Like to be able to say, hey, we had this issue, but we handled it incorrectly if we would have done this, and that's a great learning experience, but it's sometimes in the environment very hard to do.
Yeah, and I think that's where a guy like me is okay, because I'm certainly not doing this for the money. I think I get free coffee at our meetings and maybe parking, but so I'm not really at risk of getting fired. I mean, the governor could take away my appointment, but I think that's actually important, because I'm willing to say, hey, it was on my watch, so I screwed up. Did we have fuel flowing fast enough after the storm? I could go counterpoint on why, but the reality was, the perception was, we didn't have fuel flowing fast enough. So what can we do next time we get hit by a storm, such that we're going to take the blame either way? So I'd rather take that hit and figure out what we or our stakeholders did or didn't do, and make sure that we do it differently next time.
I'd say the way that we interact the best is through our various memberships and organizations. I mean, I work with the RDSTF Critical Infrastructure Working Group, which gives us access to those other critical infrastructures, airports, and beyond that have similar cyber issues. Of course, we have in Florida, we have our security directors have an association or meeting that we attend all the time. But the biggest thing that I think helps is attending conferences like this, having those times that we can actually discuss and get into the nitty-gritties of those type interactions, meeting your counterparts in those leadership positions, being able to have those discussions because you begin to know them. Okay, those kinds of relationships are important. Here at Port Tampa Bay, your best, I guess Mark Dabina is chairman of every committee that I know of. So he's deeply engaged, and maintaining that kind of engagement in those memberships, I think, is what makes that information sharing happen.
I've seen a lot of changes just over the past couple of years being involved in different conferences in port and maritime security, how the information sharing has increased substantially to be able to get to that lessons learned as to what happened. And we look back on, you know, probably globally one of the largest attacks in the maritime industry, you know, on the shipping company, came in through a third-party software and wasn't a direct attack on their system. So there was a lot of lessons learned. I know that they've shared now past that about, you know, how that happened and kind of what they're doing. On the partnership side, there was a question that came in where someone was asking about CISA on the federal government side, and if any of the ports have any interaction with CISA and the information that they put out and share kind of from a federal side.
I'll go first. for
Okay.
once. We actually are on the CISA mailing list. We stay update with their daily mails, emails, and our IT department works constantly with them on different security measures for our cyber infrastructure.
I'm not sure what CISA stands for, so I'm going to defer to my other panelists.
They are a very integral part of the information exchange. I think CISA, at least our representatives, engage very well. They attend about every one of these meetings that I've mentioned to make sure that they actually communicate and coordinate and try to make sure that as much of that information is sharing as possible. So they are a very small agency as far as being able to do that, but given the amount of real estate that they have to carry and coverage, well, down here I think we're blessed with an organization that covers very well. Can't necessarily speak to the national level because this is a national issue, but we actually get a lot of support from CISA in the Southeast.
Same at JAXPORT.
Okay. We have another question that's come in, and please, if you're in the audience, please keep submitting questions. We have another 15 minutes before we get kicked out, before the Lieutenant Governor comes on, so we want to be able to try to get through all of these. One of the questions that's come in says, what is the possibility of a cyber attack on the Port SCADA network that could produce a cyber attack with physical implications of the port, and then what could you do to prevent and respond to this?
Well, the likelihood is we get probed as well. We had an attempt of a denial of service type attack on the port last year. That led us to reach out and talk and make sure we had the cyber assist team. Luckily, our systems held, and we were able to hold that. But that's what we plan for. If we have something that comes in and then that attacks a critical piece, like if you look at anything on a port, where are you going to have the most bang for your buck if you take a system out? Well, it doesn't take a lot. You know, our cranes are lifeblood for anything moving cargo in and out of a facility. We work to make sure those are protected. Is there a one capture all, prevent anything bad from happening? No, I don't want to get into specifics on how we have things set up, but how we have those systems set up theoretically would allow us to make sure we isolate whatever system did get attacked, then bring it down to parade rest and build it back up, and we hope to have those systems back up within 24 hours. Now, we have a big attack on the system. Every port's going to be interested. The NRC's notified. 3-letter agencies are going to show up. We're going to assist them so that they can do the diagnostics, see where that's coming from, and see what other threats go to the other ports or any other critical infrastructure in the country. But, you know, we have things set up so that we harden ourselves as best as we can to keep those operational pieces of equipment going day in, day out to facilitate the commerce.
And most likely, too, from a threat perspective, if you guys are seeing something, you know, at your port on the SCADA system, there's a very high probability that that threat or that attack is being perpetrated potentially in other ports here in the United States or globally as well, too.
Absolutely.
I think from our port's perspective, what keeps me up at night would be an attack as it relates to fuel, not just because fuel is a big part of our revenue pie, but because of the amount of fuel that we supply to the state, and whether it be to Tampa Airport or to Orlando, to MacDill. And so what keeps me up is some sort of attack on our fuel terminals that would really, you know, I mean, we saw it after the storm, right? You take away toilet paper, you take away food, but you take away fuel, and people start to panic, and that would be painful.
It's all about planning for resiliency and recovery. If you look at the big picture of things, and we do get the opportunity to acid test that every once in a while. Last year's Hurricane Milton put Seaport Manatee back into the Stone Age. I mean, we didn't have power for quite an extended period of time. When we were able to get our generator powers up, we had enough redundancy to bring our main systems up. So it's all about being able to operate no matter what your state is. As far as the interconnectivity with cranes and all those other, and that OT technology, I operate under a mantra of, if it doesn't have to be online, don't put it online. Okay, not everything has to live on the internet to make it vulnerable to attack all the time. So you can isolate those systems so that they're not necessarily impacted by those targeted type attacks.
That's a great point, and something, David, that we talk to our clients about constantly is what absolutely needs to be online and what doesn't. And if you look at some of the ships that are moving cargo globally, these ships were built 20 or 25 years ago, and Windows XP was the best computer system at the time. And now, 25 years later, some of those ships are still using Windows XP because that's the only computer system that is able to interface with the engine control system. And now everybody on shoreside wants everything on that ship connected to the internet because we want the data to look at efficiency, and now you're opening that up. And I think, you know, to your point, when you look at your infrastructure, absolutely needs to be online and what doesn't need to be online. And I think, you know, from that perspective, we get a little excited about, oh, we can get all of this stuff online and we can see it remotely, but do we really need to do that with some of these systems? And so I think that's an interesting parallel from ports, you know, to vessels. When you build the infrastructure, sure, that day, that's going to be the best computer system or best OT system, but in 15 years from now, when you're still using that, you may not be able to replace that, you know, underlying computer infrastructure. One of the other questions that I wanted to put up, because we've talked about this a little bit, is training is a foundation of the cybersecurity efforts for many of the people on the panel, and we've talked a little bit about that. But how do we validate the effectiveness of the training on the workforce to ensure that the training effort is manifesting in behaviors that will ensure your security, or is the only way it works when the real world event occurs? So basically what we're looking at is, you know, the effectiveness of training, and when you guys do that, you know, how do you measure that? Because and this dovetails into one of the things I think we talked about on the call, kind of prepping for this, is the turnover in the workforce, you know, the turnover in the security workforce and potentially some of the other workforce. And, you know, bringing those kind of two pieces together, how do you guys deal with that?
I'll go first on this one. We actually have a system set up to do that, verify the effectiveness of the education by doing simulated attacks, phishing and otherwise, and see how the staff responds, and if they respond negatively, we reinforce the education and train them better. See how they respond to stimulated attacks as being proven to be an effective way to judge that education and reinforce that education if necessary.
We also have a new requirement by the end of this year with the cybersecurity requirements. So by the end of, or I think it's January, we all have to have our IT and OT folks ready and gone through cybersecurity training to make sure that they at least have the basics. I think the day-to-day operations from our cyber folks, our IT folks, evaluating, they put in measures to measure the effectiveness. They also ensure that they got the training curriculum reviewed to make sure that it met every aspect of what cyber command with the Coast Guard is requiring. So it's a constant update because the technology changes, the threats change. We aren't stagnant on how our training's being developed and then implemented to our workforce.
The scorecard, I look at it two scorecards. If I ask Paul or Mark the scorecard, it's how many attacks came in, how many got through, how many simulations did we do that we were able to combat. That's one scorecard. The scorecard I pay more attention to, and Paul, if he was here, would roll his eyes, is every time we talk about stuff like this, he likes to talk how great the scorecard is, but it's who else have you talked to? Did you talk to JAX? Did you talk to Putnam? Did you talk to Manatee and figure out what their scorecard looks like? And did you share those experiences? Did you ask them theirs? And that's really how I score it. Is not only how did we do internally, but how did we share that information? Again, being honest enough to say, hey, this got through, and calling Manatee and say, hey, this got through. But also asking Manatee, hey, what came through yours? And making sure we're honest with each other.
The important thing is to remember training is not a one and done thing. Okay, you go and you give them the awareness, you go and give them the training, you have to run exercises on it, you have to run drills on it, you have to evaluate whether the training is taking. Okay, and refresher training, it's a constant process to keep the awareness up, because this is a true threat, and it is probably the most common way that these things are perpetrated is through the actions of some of your own staff, you know, clicking on some link that they either got through a phishing attack, spoofing, or whatever, okay? But maintaining that cyber awareness and evaluating that your training's effective is the two biggest things that are important to make it work.
And that's a good point, because you look at today's cyber threat and how it's evolving is changing constantly. I think we're going to very shortly, with the integration fully of AI into kind of the attack vector on cyber, I think we're going to get to the point where previous attacks are no longer going to be perpetrated, that every attack that we're going to see is a 0 day. And look at, the training has to evolve of how we trained our personnel last month is going to be different than how we look at the training from a cyber perspective next month, because in the in that 60-day cycle, the threats that we're going to see are going to be totally different. And we're seeing that on the commercial side with our commercial customers of how rapidly those threats are changing just over a 30 or a 60-day period. So it's interesting from that perspective. David, it is a constant and ongoing process to keep people trained. And it's, not just, oh, look at the email address on the email to click on that link. And it goes a lot further, in that with everything else that we're trying to do from a training perspective. We talked a little bit about the coordination with CISA on information sharing. The question is, how can state and federal partners better integrate maritime sector intel through groups like the MTS ISAC to ensure operational data flows quickly to port leaders? So it's, hey, how do we work from the CISA side to the MTS ISAC to be able to move that information as quickly as possible, like into your hands?
Again, for me, it's all about fostering the relationships. When you start knowing the people that you talk to and you start getting in that information loop, information flows pretty freely, pretty efficiently. When all of these people don't know each other and you don't participate and you don't engage, that is an impediment to that operation, because there's a much better flow when you're within the group and you are working together, because you actually are able to better support each other. So again, it's engagement. It's really engagement through our leadership and coordinating with each other to make sure that we are in the atmosphere to be able to facilitate that kind of exchange.
I think part of it is also the way in which you receive that information. A lot of times when an acronym comes down and says, hey, you're vulnerable this way, your feathers get ruffled, that no, I'm not vulnerable, this is my job and I'm ready. But I think it's being ready to receive that information and being open to the fact that you're not as ready as you think, just because, like you said, things are changing hourly.
Yeah, and I think Chad and Dave hit on it before. Being open and honest about it is important. So if I have something, I need to be able to speak freely about that with our partners to make sure that we're addressing the right issue. We don't want to be set it up here, emperor no clothes, or our head in the sand that yeah, that issue's there, I'm going to ignore it. Well, it's going to bite you in the butt, and we got to make sure that all of us are involved and we communicate about it.
And that's kind of gets back to one of the points I think that was made earlier, is the importance of a conference like this, is to be able to bring not only the port leadership and the security leadership, but also the commercial side of that together and the commercial partnership, because everybody has a different capability when it comes to what they can provide, whether it's the threat mitigation or the tools to be able to mitigate that. So these discussions are important. And one of the things, having the opportunity to speak at conferences, not just here in the United States, but globally, it seems like the United States, we do a better job of this interagency, kind of interdepartmental, interport, and kind of commercial collaboration than a lot of other places do around the world from what I've seen. And I spent a lot of time in the UK. We're a UK-based company, and we're starting to now see that kind of model that we have here in the United States, move overseas, because that collaboration is important. You don't want to understand your partner's capabilities when, there's a threat or the hurricane hits or something happens. You want to know them and be able to pick up the phone and say, hey, we have this problem. Are you guys seeing this? What's going on right away? So with that, we are coming to the end of the panel on time. Are we at 11, or is it? We have 5 more minutes. Okay. I'm a horrible game show host. That's what I want to do when I retire, is host a game show. Would be just absolutely, So one more question here, and I'm going to go back to the drone threat, is detection and identification capability for the UAS threat is evolving in concert with mitigation. However, the speed at which mitigation of a weaponized UAS will likely remain inadequate. Awareness without skill and capability equates to anxiety. What ideas or strategies are being considered to prevent the UAS attacks?
Yes. No, there's some challenges with it. I think the discussion between the Coast Guard and FAA to at least put in place the no-fly zones is a great first step, and appreciate them looking at that issue to try and make sure, even for like cruise industry and how it affects ship and transit, that's encouraging. It's a difficult problem set when you're talking about engaging the target. I think they're like the general had said earlier, there's technology out there, but those have some risks associated to the local community, things along those lines if you employ them. But we're going to have to have very smart people try and develop something that minimizes the risk. The political side, as they were referring to earlier, has to get done so that we know the drone threat is a real threat to all the port and other critical infrastructure throughout the states. And we have to have a viable solution that mitigates the risks associated with it, because I'm sure Russia's Strategic Command, they were concerned after they saw what happened. So that brought a lot of concern to us as well.
I think clearly defining our, we can talk about our bark, but what is the definition of our bite? What are we allowed to do? Because we chase the different threats that, as we've all stated, are constantly changing. But you figure out what your detection is, but I don't think any of us know, I certainly don't, what is our bite? And until, whether it's on a federal level or a local level, someone giving each of us the permission or the clarification of what we're allowed to do, because you can't really chase a technology. You can sit there and say you're going to jam them, or you're going to do a magnetic pulse, or there's a laser that fries the electric. But are we even allowed to do that? And also, are you, once we define our bite, are you willing to face the consequences? As big as our port is here, acreage-wise, and a lot of, we have our own drones, but at the same time, some of our tenants have drones. And are you prepared to go shoot down one of your tenants' drones and face those consequences? And we got, McDill, and we got Peter O'Knight, and again, are you willing? I mean, it might be my son flying from over there on Bayshore. You can shoot his drone down. I won't mind at all. But you shoot one of your tenants, or you shoot the military, they're going to be mad.
Yeah, it's a difficult problem.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that we keep evaluating on how to address. I think we have an awareness. I think we keep learning every day the capabilities of drones every time I turn on the news and I watch the war in Ukraine, because it's an extremely credible and a threat and a very useful device. But what I think I can tell you sure about the evolution of threats, we sat in this entire panel for all this time, but we haven't mentioned TWIC once. So we can see that things are evolving and our focus is changing.
So we have a couple of minutes left. Is there any kind of final closing thoughts that any of the panelists that you guys wanted to put forward before we end the panel? I know there was still some pending questions that we have. I think most of us are going to be around for the rest of the day, so during breaks or lunch, if your question didn't get answered, definitely make sure you come and see one of us. But do you guys have any closing thoughts on the panel?
Yeah, I would say pay attention to the MARSEC advisory that the Coast Guard put out, 0125. Make sure you understand the implications of a change in MARSEC levels. We just ran a tabletop exercise with all of our partners, whether or not they were the FSOs for our tenants, but it was the state, local, and federal folks on there, and having a discussion if you went from 1 to 2 to 3, and what those impacts would be. You know, the worst case scenario, the threat is so real, it's so imminent that you're shutting down operations. Well, what does that mean? Is it just traffic? Is that, you know, the impacts to the distribution centers? So make sure, you have awareness that that's out there. You have a discussion with your FSOs about what that is, and then engage your partners so everybody has a clear understanding of if the Coast Guard does change that, what is that going to impact not just your port, but everything surrounding the port?
I think also another thing we need to do as ports is communicate better together, come to these conferences and learn about the various threats and how we can address them together. I think together we'll be stronger than alone, especially when it comes to the drone issue. That is a political issue as well. As a group, we could probably lobby for a solution in Tallahassee that could address all our concerns.
And I'll echo what Sam was saying. You know, not just at these conferences, whether it be, you know, security folks in general, but if there's a counterpart, you know, a board member or something encouraging, you know, I'm as you've heard, I don't mind talking. So if anyone reached out to me and wanted to share experiences, I'd be more than willing to share right back. And to reiterate what Stephen was saying, it's really important that in our daily planning and development that we understand what the implications are of changing MARSEC levels. Is that surge capacity, if that's what is in our plans, available? We don't just train security officers to meet all of the requirements and to have the awareness they need to support us appropriately in 10 minutes. I mean, making sure you have the pool of resources to draw from and coordinating with is an important factor to work through all the time.
I wanted to thank all of our panelists, thank all of you for the questions. I don't want to get in trouble for holding up the Lieutenant Governor because I know that he's here now, but thank you guys very much for being a part of this, and thank you to the audience.